The Crescent Moon Club, in association with Cyclops Entertainment, in conjunction with ABT, presents Omnibus Unlimited, a roundtable discussion of topics that must be addressed now. Radiovision for the 21st century. Hello everybody, I'm John Horrigan, host and producer of Omnibus Unlimited. Tonight, a special edition, UFO Crash at Roswell, the sequence of events. We're going to be reading tonight from UFO Crash at Roswell, Kevin D. Randle and Donald R. Schmit. July 1947, the sequence of events. Wednesday, July 2nd, 1947, 9:50 p.m. Mr. and Mrs. Dan Wilmot reported an oval-shaped object like two invert saucers faced mouth-to-mouth, moving at a high rate of speed, flew over their house in Roswell, New Mexico. The object was heading to the northwest. During a thunderstorm in the Corona, New Mexico area, W.W. Mac Brazel heard a tremendous thunderclap that sounded like an explosion, but that was somehow different from the rest of the thunder. Others in the area reported hearing the same phenomenon. William Woody reported that he and his father watched a bright meteor described as white with a red tail streak across the sky, falling to the horizon. Thursday, July 3rd, 1947. Because of the rain the night before, Brazel was inspecting the pastures. July and August are the rainy months, and Brazel planned to move the livestock onto the fields that had received the rain. During the inspection, he discovered a large debris field. Scattered on the slopes and into the sinkholes and depressions was metal, plastic-like bits. There were beams, pieces of lightweight material, foil, and string. The debris was thick enough that the sheep refused to cross the field and had to be driven around it to water more than a mile away. Brazel, taking a few scraps of the material, headed to the home of his closest neighbors, Floyd and Loretta Proctor. He showed them a little sliver of material that refused to burn and that couldn't be cut. The Proctors suggested that he take it into town to show the sheriff. Loretta Proctor also remembered the rewards being offered for proof of the flying disc's reality and thought that Mac should try to claim the money. Later that evening, Brazel removed the large circular piece of the debris from the range. According to Bill Brazel, his father either loaded it into the back of his truck or dragged it along behind. He stored it in a livestock shed about 3 miles north of the crash site. Saturday, July 5th, 1947. Military bases along the West Coast had fighters on standby in case the flying discs were seen. A few of the bases in Oregon and Washington had planes equipped with gun cameras on airborne alert. Sherman Campbell of Circleville, Ohio, reported to the sheriff that he thought he had an explanation for some of the flying disc sightings. He'd found a weather balloon on his farm. It was metallic with a kite-like appendage on it. Under the right conditions, as it drifted on the upper atmospheric winds, it could look like a flying disc. The device was on display at the local newspaper office and then returned to Campbell. Jean Campbell Romero, Campbell's daughter, reported that it had been kept in the barn for years afterward. Sunday, July 6th, 1947. Brazel got up early, as was his habit according to Norris Proctor, completed his chores, and then drove into Roswell, about 75 miles away. He stopped at the office of Sheriff George A. Wilcox. Contrary to public reports, Wilcox was excited about the find and suggested that they call the military. While they were waiting for the military officers to arrive, Wilcox dispatched 2 deputies to the ranch. They had only the directions given by Brazel, but both men were familiar with the territory, and Wilcox thought that they'd be able to find the debris field that Brazel described. Frank Joyce, a reporter and announcer for radio station KGFL, said that he called the sheriff and asked if there was anything interesting happening at the office. According to Joyce, Wilcox told him that there was someone there that he should interview. Joyce talked to Brazel, but said that he didn't pay much attention to what Brazel was saying. He was busy trying to run the radio station, getting records changed, and listen to the story that Brazel was telling all at the same time. Colonel William Blanchard, commander of the 509th Bomb Group, Major Jesse A. Marcel, the air intelligence officer, and a man in civilian clothes, a counterintelligence agent, responded to the sheriff's call. According to Phyllis McGuire, daughter of the sheriff, the military arrived almost as soon as the sheriff had hung up the phone. The officers interviewed Brazel, examined some pieces of the material, and then Blanchard ordered Marcel and the CIC man to accompany Brazel to the ranch. Blanchard, assured that he was in possession of something unusual, alerted the next higher headquarters. According to Blanchard's first wife, Ethel, he thought that they might have found something that belonged to the Soviets. No one mentioned any type of balloon. Blanchard, acting on orders from General Clements McMullen, passed to him by Colonel Thomas Dubose, sealed in a bag some of the material Brazel had brought to the sheriff's office. The material was then flown on to the Fort Worth Army Airfield. After the military officers left along with Brazel, the 2 deputies returned. They hadn't found the debris field, but they did find a burned area in one of the pastures. The sand had been turned to glass and blackened. It looked as as if something circular had touched down. The aircraft from Roswell was met at the Fort Worth Army Airfield by DuBose and Colonel Alan D. Clark. Clark received the plastic bag with the debris and walked to the command B-26 to fly it on to Washington, D.C. and General McMullen. Because it was so far out to the ranch over the roads that were less than adequate, Brazel, Marcel, and the CIC agent didn't arrive until after dark. They stayed at the ranch house, ate cold beans and crackers, and waited for daylight. Marcel used a Geiger counter on the larger piece of wreckage that Brazel had stored in the cattle shed. He detected no sign of radiation. Monday, July 7th, 1947. Brazel took the two military officers out to the crash site. According to Marcel, the debris field was 3/4 of a mile long and 200 to 300 feet wide. There was a gouge starting at the northern end of it that extended for 400 or 500 feet towards the other end. Bill Brazel said that it looked as if something had touched down and skipped along. The largest piece of debris was found at the southern edge of the gouge. Marcel described the debris as being as thin as newspaper print, but so strong that he couldn't bend it. There was foil that when crumbled up, it would unfold itself without a sign of a wrinkle. And then there were the I-beams that would flex slightly and that had some sort of writing or symbols on them. The descriptions of the debris were confirmed by Bill Brazel, Loretta Proctor, Tommy Tyree, Walt Whitmore Sr., Jesse Marcel Jr., Mrs. V.O. Marcel, Robert Cherky, Robert Smith, O.W. Pappy Henderson, and Louis S. Rickett. Marcel and the CIC agent walked the perimeter of the field and then ranged out looking for more debris or another crash site, but found nothing. Finally, they returned and spent the remainder of the day collecting the debris they could. They loaded the rear of Marcel's 42 Buick and then the Jeep carryall driven by the CIC man. About dusk, they left the debris field for Roswell. Lieutenant General Nathan F. Twining, the commander of the Air Materiel Command, the parent organization at Wright-Patterson Field in Ohio, changed his plans suddenly and flew into Alamogordo Army Airfield, later Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico. Twining was just a short drive from the Roswell Army Airfield. Tuesday, July 8th, 1947. 2 a.m. Marcel, excited by the find, stopped at his house on the way to the base. He awakened his wife and son to show them the material. They spent an hour examining it, scattered on the kitchen floor. Marcel was not breaking regulations since nothing he brought in had yet been classified. Marcel then collected it all, loaded it back into the car, and drove on to the base. 6 a.m. Marcel and the CIC agent visited with Blanchard in his quarters, telling him what they'd seen. In later years, Marcel would insist that they knew the moment that they saw the debris field that the crash was of something that had not been manufactured on Earth. Blanchard called the Provost Marshal, identified in the 509th Unit history as Major Edwin Easley. Blanchard ordered Easley to post guards on the roads around the crash site, denying access to anyone without official business. He ordered Easley to find Brazel and have him escort the MPs to the crash site. Blanchard also called the 8th Air Force headquarters and advised them that Marcel had returned with more of the debris. By this time, though, Blanchard and Marcel knew that it was not a Russian device. 8th Air Force Headquarters in Fort Worth relayed Blanchard's message up the chain of command, alerting the Pentagon about the strange material. A special flight from Andrews Air Force Base was arranged for men coming from the Pentagon. 7:30 a.m. The regular morning staff meeting had been moved up. Blanchard discussed what they had found and what they should do about it. Attending that meeting were Marcel, the CIC man, Louis S. Rickett, Lieutenant Colonel James I. Hopkins, the operations officer, Major Patrick Saunders, the base adjutant, Major Isidore Brown, the personnel officer, and Lieutenant Colonel Ulysses S. Nero, the supply officer. There is reason to believe that Lieutenant Colonel Charles W. Horton, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand L. Andre, and Lieutenant Walter Holt, the PIO, were also in attendance. During the meeting, they decided how to handle the retrieval and who would be accomplishing which tasks. 9 a.m. The CIC agent and his assistant drew a staff car and drove out to the crash site. Following them was another contingent of MPs. They were stopped by the guards that had been posted earlier. When they arrived, they saw that the MPs had already been stationed around the debris field to protect it. Blanchard and members of his staff were on the phones conferring with higher headquarters. Marcel and some of the wreckage were ordered to Fort Worth so that Brigadier General Roger Ramey could inspect it there. 11 a.m. Walter Holt finished the press release and was preparing to take it into town. The first paragraph said, "The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday." He took it first to one of the radio stations. By noon, he had given a copy of the release to both radio stations and to both daily newspapers. The CIC men at the ranch checked the ground again. The guards were posted around the gouge, around the debris field, and finally on the hills surrounding the area. The CIC men located Mac Brazel and took him back to Roswell. 12 p.m. noontime. Every point of contact in Roswell reported that they were swamped by calls. Sheriff Wilcox reported calls from Europe and Asia. Art McQuitty, editor of the Roswell Morning Dispatch, said that from the moment the press release hit the wire, he was on the phone. Walter Hote said the same thing. The world was trying to learn what happened in Roswell. The first of the special flights from Washington arrived. On the plane was Warrant Officer Robert Thomas. Thomas and the men were in uniform upon arrival, but quickly changed to civilian clothes. These men would remain at Roswell throughout the retrieval. The phones at the base had started to ring. Blanchard, irritated because he couldn't get a phone line out, ordered Hout to do something about all of the incoming calls. Hout said there was nothing he could do about all of the incoming calls. Sheriff Wilcox, wondering what happened out at the crash site, sent 2 more deputies out. This time they ran into the cordon thrown up by the Army and were turned back. The Army was letting no unauthorized personnel onto the crash site. Mid-afternoon, Brazel was flown back towards the ranch. This was not the first flight back, as the 509th tried to find the flight crew of the craft. They were all sure that there had to be one. The second crash site was located and men on the ground were directed towards it. Brazel, because he knew the land well, was helping to direct them towards the second site. Before the Army could arrive, others in the area stumbled onto the second site. Grady L. Barney Barnett was surveying the ranches for the suitability of irrigation. According to Vern Maltese, a close friend, Barnett found the remains of the disc. Maltese never asked about the craft because Barnett told him about the occupants. Small men, 4 or 5 feet tall, thin with big heads. They were lying outside of the craft. While Barnett was standing there close enough to touch the bodies, a group of students and archaeologists arrived. They too saw the bodies in the strange craft. The Army arrived at the second crash site and was horrified to find civilians there already. The civilians were rounded up and told that they had stumbled upon something that had national security aspects. They were never to mention what they had seen. The officer in charge told them that the government would be able to find them if they talked. They were escorted off the site as the Army moved in and began to cover their bodies. Robert Shirkey, standing in the operations building, watched as MPs began carrying wreckage through to load onto a C-54 of the 1st Air Transport Unit. To see better, he had to step around Colonel Blanchard. Pappy Henderson, Captain O.W. Henderson, then took the material to Wright Field in Ohio. He had a chance to see some of the material and described it as something very strange and like nothing he'd ever seen. 2:30 p.m. Blanchard decided that it was time to go on leave. There were too many phone calls into the base asking to speak with him. He, along with a few members of the staff, drove out to the crash site. Those left at the base are told to inform the reporters that the colonel was now on leave. 3 p.m. Marcel, who had been told that he was going to Fort Worth with the wreckage, took off for the Fort Worth Army Airfield in Texas. According to Sergeant Robert Porter, one of the flight crew, there were only a few packages loaded onto the airplane. One, a triangular package about 2 feet long, was wrapped in brown paper. The other 3 were about shoebox-sized and also wrapped. Porter said that it seemed that there was nothing in them. Johnny McBoyle, a reporter for radio station KSWS in Roswell, tried to reach the crash site. According to Merle Tucker and Lydia Sleppy, who worked at the parent station in Albuquerque, McBoyle mentioned an object that looked like a crushed dishpan and then told her to hang on. There was an argument with someone close, and then McBoyle told her to never mind. He had made a mistake. Moments later, as she was trying to get something out over the teletype, it began to type out an incoming message from the FBI. She was ordered not to complete the transmission because the item is of national security interest. Marcel was in Ramey's office with some of the debris. The general wanted to see where it had been found, and Marcel was taken to a map room. Once Ramey was satisfied, they walked back to the office, but the debris was gone. In its place was a weather balloon that had been ripped apart. Late afternoon, Brazel was back in Roswell, having helped find the second crash site. Now the military dropped the ball. No one told him to stay close, so Brazel left. Walt Whitmore found him in Roswell and took him to the radio station, KGFL. Whitmore and another reporter interviewed Brazel using the wire recorder. On it, Brazel told him the whole story. Whitmore then took Brazel to his house to keep him out of the hands of the military. In Fort Worth, reporter J. Bon Johnson of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram was told to drive to the base. His editor said that they had a flying saucer coming in from Roswell and he wanted Johnson out there to cover the story. Johnson arrived at the Fort Worth Army Air Base and was told to head straight up to Ramey's office for the interview. On the floor were the remains of a weather balloon. Part of the rubber in it had burned, and Johnson was surprised that Ramey would keep it in his office. Johnson took 4 pictures of Ramey and the wreckage and then headed back to his office. More people arrived at the crash site, and they were cleaning it up. Men with wheelbarrows were moving across the field, throwing the debris in. When filled, they took the debris to collection points. The debris was then loaded into covered trucks to be driven into Roswell. Warrant Officer Irving Newton was ordered from the weather station to Ramey's office. Newton, in front of a small number of reporters and officers of the 8th Air Force, identified the wreckage on the office floor as a Ron target balloon. He was photographed and then sent back to his regular duties. Ramey, with the identity of the wreckage established, announced to the world that the officers at Roswell were fooled by a weather balloon. Ramey also appeared on local radio station WBAP. Blanchard and members of his staff arrived at the ranch and were taken to the second crash site where the bodies were located. The bodies were loaded into the back of a truck and then covered by a tarpaulin. In Roswell, the base hospital began to call a local mortuary, asking questions about the preservation of tissue and what specific chemicals would do to the tissue. The mortician Glenn Dennis reported he received 4 or 5 such phone calls about it and decided that there had been some sort of fatal crash at the base. Lewis S. Rickett said an unscheduled flight from Bowling Field in Washington, D.C. arrived. He gave the crew a sealed box with wreckage in it. Melvin E. Brown, a member of Squadron K 509th Bomb Group, was told to climb into the back of a truck at the second crash site. He was told not to look under the tarp, but the moment everyone's back was turned, he did. Under the tarpaulin were the bodies of the alien flight crew. Brown said that they were small, with large heads, and that he thought that the skin was yellow or orange. The bodies arrived at the base and were taken to the hospital for examination. Dr. Jesse Johnson pronounced them dead and did the preliminary work on them. The mortician, Glenn Dennis, still believing there had been a fatal crash on the base, drove out. The MP on the gate, recognizing him, waved him through, and he drove to the hospital. There he entered and was met by an Army nurse. She told him to get out of there before he got himself into trouble. 2 MPs spotted him and bodily threw him out of the hospital. A guard at the gate reported that a truck carrying dry ice entered late in the evening. He was surprised by the late hour of the delivery. A check of the local ice house revealed no records available for the 1940s. The bodies were sealed into a long crate, 15 by 3 feet by 4 feet, and the crate was moved to a hangar. It was left there with spotlights playing on it while MPs stood guard. They never approached it. Brown was given the task of guarding the outside of the hangar. Brown's commanding officer approached and said, "Come on, Brownie, let's have a look inside." But there was nothing to see then because everything had been packed and crated and was ready for shipment out of there. Wednesday, July 9th, 1947. Morning newspapers were carrying the story that the flying saucer found in Roswell was a weather device. Some quoted Ramey, while others quoted sources, including senators in Washington. Brazel was still in Roswell, but still in the company of Walt Whitmore Sr. Whitmore was trying to protect his exclusive interview with Brazel. Cleanup at the ranch resumed with sunup. The military was trying to get everything picked up before any more civilians stumbled across it. Robert Smith of the 1st Air Transport Unit said that they began loading crates into C-54s about 8 o'clock in the morning. The problem wasn't the weight, but the size of the crates. They felt as if they were empty. They loaded 3 aircraft, all destined to Kirtland and then on to Los Alamos. According to Roswell Army Airfield Head Secretary Elizabeth Kyle, the telephones at the base were still tied up by the incoming calls from around the world. The military found Brazel again and this time took steps to ensure that he didn't get away from them. They interrogated him at the base, asking him the same questions over and over again. More of the wreckage was brought into the base and was now being taken to a different location where it was boxed into crates of various sizes and shapes. The crates were built at Roswell and conformed to the standards used to ship other cargo. Bud Payne, a rancher in the Corona area, was chasing a stray cow. As he crossed onto the Foster Ranch, a jeep carrying soldiers roared over a ridgeline, bearing down on him. He was carried from the Foster Ranch physically. Brazel was taken into town, into the offices of the Roswell Daily Record. There he gave reporters, including Jason Callahan and R.A. Adair from Albuquerque, a new story. He told them that he'd found the balloon on June 14th and hadn't taken it into Roswell until 3 weeks later because he had no phone and no radio, and he didn't know the world was looking for flying discs. Brazel, in that article, however, said that he had found weather balloons on other occasions, and what he'd found this time was no weather balloon. Ramey's weather officer Newton claimed that the weather balloon was a special kind and said, "We use them because they go much higher than the eye can see." Floyd Proctor and Lyman Strickland were in Roswell and saw Mac Brazel. He was being escorted around by 3 military men. He ignored both Proctor and Strickland, something that he wouldn't normally have done. Whitmore at radio station KGFL got a phone call from Washington telling him not to air the interview with Brazel. According to Judd Roberts, if we played the interview, we could expect to lose our license from the FCC in the next couple of days. According to Art McQuitty, an officer from the base swept through Roswell picking up copies of Hout's press release. Frank Joyce confirmed it, saying that someone had searched the offices of KGFL and taken important papers that he had written about the matter. The military searched all of the radio stations and newspapers, taking anything that related to that story. At noon, the crate that had been sitting in the empty hangar guarded by the MPs was moved out to bomb pit number 1. According to the men who were there, nothing other than weapons was ever stored in the bomb pit. Late in the afternoon, a flight crew at the skeet range was told they had a special flight coming up. The squadron operations officer, Major Edgar Skelly, told the aircraft commander to keep everybody together. 3 C-54s from the 1st Air Transport Unit took off on short flights to Los Alamos. All 3 aircraft were loaded with crates holding the wreckage, and all the crates were marked with stencils saying "Top Secret." Armed guards watched the loading of the aircraft. Smith was sure the crates held debris because he was shown a small piece of the foil that could be wadded and then would straighten itself out. The flight crew pulled from the skeet range was told to quickly pre-flight their aircraft. Once that was done and they had the engines running, they taxied out to the bomb pit. According to one of the crewmen on that flight, the only places on the base where the bomb pit could be observed were the tower and portions of the flight line. A sealed wooden unmarked crate was brought out and loaded into the bomb bay of B-29, tail number 7301. It was guarded by 6 MPs, an officer, 2 NCOs, and 3 enlisted men, all armed. They never let the crate out of their sight. At Fort Worth, the aircraft was met by a number of officers, including a mortician. The bombardier recognized the man because he had gone to school with them. The crate was unloaded and the flight crew was told to head back to Roswell. There was no debriefing given to them at Fort Worth. According to one of the crewmen, and confirmed by Robert Slusher, Marcel returned with them on that flight. He was in Fort Worth for about 24 hours, and that kept him out of the reporter's line of fire until the cover story could be put into place. Frank Joyce reported that officers brought Mac Brazel to radio station KGFL to be interviewed. This time Brazel had a new story, one that was significantly different than the one he told on Sunday. Joyce pointed that out, and Brazel responded that it would go hard on him if he didn't tell the new story. On his way out of the radio station, he said, "You know those stories about little green men? Well, they're not green." By 8 p.m., the flight crew was back. Again, they were not debriefed, but were told that they had flown the General's furniture to Fort Worth. They were cautioned not to tell anyone what they had done, including their families. This flight had not taken place. Upon his return, Marcel headed to the CIC office and confronted the officer there. Marcel wanted to see the reports that had been filed in his absence, but the CIC officer refused. Marcel pointed out that he was the senior officer, but the CIC agent claimed his orders were from Washington. "Take it up with them," he said. John Tiffany, Sr., a crew chief assigned to Wright Field, flew on a special mission to the south. They picked up debris that none of them could identify and a huge thermos-like jug. Tiffany told family members about the bodies, his descriptions matching those of the other witnesses. The Las Vegas Review-Journal carried a story quoting a United Press report that said, "Reports of flying saucers whizzing through the sky fell off sharply today as the Army and Navy began a concentrated campaign to stop the rumors." The story also said that the AAF headquarters in Washington delivered a blistering rebuke to officers at Roswell. That same article was printed in other newspapers around the country. Thursday, July 10th, 1947. Bill Brazel, reading the morning paper, learned about his father's activities at Roswell. He realized that no one would be at the ranch and made plans to get down there to help out. At both crash sites, the men were working to get everything cleaned up. They wanted no bit of wreckage left and no signs that they were ever there. Mac Brazel was being held in the guest house on the base. The officers there were still trying to convince him that he was not to say anything about what he'd seen. They were also trying to keep him out of the way of reporters still searching for a story. He was given a physical by doctors at the base hospital. There were rumors flying around Roswell about the event. People began to hear that there were bodies and that there was even talk that one of them was alive when the military got there. This has yet to be confirmed. Major W.D. Pritchard from Alamogordo claimed that there had been a unit from his base in Roswell launching balloons around June 14th. That was undoubtedly what Brazel found. Friday, July 11th, 1947. The debriefings of all the participants were underway. According to Frank Kaufman, they were taken into a room in small groups and told that the recovery was a highly classified event. No one was to talk about it to anyone. They were to forget that it all ever happened. Saturday, July 12th, 1947. Bill Brazel and his wife Shirley
arrived at the ranch, but there was no one around. And Brazel began to work, first surveying the ranch to see what needed to be done. He saw no evidence that the military was still around. The trucks, people, and the cordon were gone. On this weekend, there were no aircraft with gun cameras searching for flying discs. There were no aircraft on standby waiting for orders to take off. In fact, there were reports that an order went out grounding all aircraft to keep them out of the sky and the search. Tuesday, July 15th, 1947. Bill Brazel reported that his dad returned from Roswell. He would not say much except that they kept asking him the same questions over and over again, and to say that Bill Brazel was better off not knowing what had happened. Besides, Mac Brazel took an oath that he said he would never reveal in detail what he had seen. By now, most of the world had forgotten that a flying saucer had been reported to have crashed in New Mexico. So that is the timeline so far in Roswell, New Mexico. What happened from July 2nd up to the 15th of July, 1947. Now, there are other cases and other tidbits that I'd like to relate to you concerning this matter, stories of people being affected by this Roswell incident. Late July 1947. Mac Brazel visited the Lyman Stricklands and told them what had gone down in Roswell. Marion Strickland said that Mac was upset over being in jail and the shabby way he had been treated by the military. He sat in the kitchen at the table drinking coffee as he complained about the military. He would say nothing about what he'd found other than that he'd been sworn to secrecy by the military. August 1947. Mac Brazel and ranch hand Tommy Tyree spotted a piece of wreckage floating in the water at the bottom of a sinkhole. Neither man bothered to climb down to retrieve it. September 1947. Louis S. Rickett was assigned to assist Dr. Lincoln La Paz from the University of New Mexico. La Paz's 3-week assignment was to determine, if possible, the speed and trajectory of the craft when it hit. According to Rickett, they discovered a touchdown point 5 miles from the debris field where the sand was crystallized, apparently from the heat, and they discovered more of the foil-like material. Given all that, La Paz, not knowing that bodies had been recovered, was convinced that it had been an unoccupied probe from another planet. September 1948. Louis S. Rickett, while in Albuquerque, met with Lincoln La Paz. According to Rickett, La Paz told him that he, La Paz, was still convinced what they had found was an unoccupied probe from another planet. In the year that had passed, La Paz and his secret dealings with various government projects had nothing to cause him to change his mind. October 1948. Louis S. Rickett met with John Worth, another CIC man. Rickett asked Worth about the status of the material recovered at Roswell and was told that they had yet to figure it out. According to Worth, they hadn't been able to cut it. Summer 1949. Bill Brazel, in the 2 years following the crash, found scraps of the craft. His dad confirmed it, saying, "That looks like some of the contraption I found." Brazel, in Corona, mentioned that he had found some of the pieces. According to him, the next day, Captain Armstrong and 3 others from the Roswell base arrived and asked for the material. Armstrong reminded Brazel that his dad had cooperated with them completely. It was Brazel's patriotic duty to give it up. Brazel couldn't think of a good reason to deny it to them and surrendered it to the authorities. 1961. UPI stringer Jay West reported that he was working in Alamogordo in the area of the White Sands Proving Ground when he became friendly with the base public information officer. The PIO had found a file that mentioned the Roswell crash that included a map. The PIO got a topographical map of the crash site. According to West, they made trips out to try to locate the crash. West described the map as showing the debris field and then 2.5 miles to the east, a second crash site. 1978. Pappy Henderson confided in his close friend, John Kromschroeder, that he flew wreckage from a crashed saucer from Roswell, New Mexico to Dayton, Ohio. He showed Kromschroeder a fragment of the debris and told his friend that he'd seen the bodies. Jesse Marcel was located by researcher Stan Friedman. Marcel told Friedman that he was sure that the debris was nothing from Earth. Later, Marcel granted interviews to various news organizations, but those reports did not gain wide dissemination. May 1979. Bob Pratt interviewed Jesse Marcel and published an article in which Marcel admitted that he was the intelligence officer who had recovered the parts of a flying saucer. 1980. In Search of aired a program about UFO cover-ups and interviewed Marcel. In the course of that interview, Marcel again said that whatever was found, he was sure that it was nothing from this Earth. January 1980. Len Stringfield published the second of his status reports on crash retrievals. Included in it was a report from Major Jesse A. Marcel telling of his experiences on the debris field in July 1947. September 1980. Charles Berlitz and William L. Moore published The Roswell Incident, the first attempt at a comprehensive analysis of the events at Roswell. In the course of the research, Moore and Stanton Friedman located more than 60 witnesses who had some knowledge of the event. 1982. After reading a story about the events at Roswell in a tabloid newspaper, Pappy Henderson told his wife about his role. He told her that everything in that tabloid story was true, which surprised him. He hadn't expected them to get their facts right, and that included the descriptions of the bodies. October 1988. Jim Parker reported that his son had seen a strange pickup truck on the ranch. Parker chased it down and discovered two men sitting in a U.S. Air Force pickup with a camper on the back. There were maps of the local area in it. He described the men as in their late 20s or early 30s and thought they were both low-ranking. They claimed they were surveying the area to put in a radar site to monitor low-flying aircraft, but then asked if Parker knew anything about the Roswell crash, mentioning that the crash site was somewhere close. Parker had never heard of it and didn't know what they were talking about. The men left the ranch then. No one from the Air Force had asked permission to enter the ranch from the ranch owners, and no one had checked with the Bureau of Land Management about the availability of property in the area.
September 1989. The CUFO's scientific expedition to the Roswell crash site was made. This was only the preliminary investigation that discovered nothing new. Weeks after they were gone, the ranch foreman reported that someone had been out there driving all over the site where the expedition had been searching. June 1991. Avon Books releases this book, UFO Crash at Roswell, by Kevin D. Randle and Donald R. Schmit. That's it for the show, everybody. Thanks for watching Omnibus Unlimited, a production of the Crescent Moon Club.